Hello, this is Anthony Davis, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about a question that gets asked a lot in yoga, and that is when your arm is over your head, what should you be doing with your shoulder blade and shoulder girdle in general? Should you be, pulling it down and back, packing the lats? Should be upwardly rotating, elevating, protracting, blah, blah, blah. Lots of answers to this question. Well, basically it depends. I hate that answer. It's really obnoxious, but it does depend on what activity you're actually doing. And you'll find that in different activities, sometimes you will be required to do the opposite thing based on where the force is coming at. And we'll talk about why you therefore need to resist the force. My name is Anthony Davis. This is Shapeshift Wellness, the channel that uses evidence and research to explore fitness, yoga, and meditation. If you like that sort of thing, subscribe to my channel, like this video, share it with your friends. Now let's learn about force and why we need to resist it when we are doing activity of really any kind. So let's look at a yoga pose. Here we go. Resisting the force. So what is happening to your arm and shoulder due to the force of gravity in downward facing dog? That's the question I want to ask you. So think about that for a second. I'm going to be exploring a few different activities, and I'm going to be exploring them through what is happening to your arm. Okay, we're going to have the arm in the same position, which is full flexion, meaning your arm is over your head, your biceps are by your ears. Same joint position, and yet the forces acting on the arm and the shoulder are the opposite. So here we go, downward facing dog, and we find that the ground reaction force, because gravity is pulling you down towards the ground, well, basically we can think about it like the ground is pushing against your hands at an angle. So it's pushing your shoulders up, right? It's trying gravity. If gravity had its way on your shoulders in downward facing dog, your shoulders would press down towards your hips. Okay. So because of that, we need to do the opposite. So we need to push into the ground. We need to resist that ground reaction force that is happening due to gravity. And we need to therefore push into the ground. So that looks like in the shoulder blade, and I've got videos on upward rotation. I've got tons of videos on upward rotation and shoulder blade biomechanics and shoulder joint biomechanics. And in fact, I even have a free shoulder impingement course on my website. So go to shapeshiftwellness.com and sign up for the free area and take that course. It has quizzes and stuff like that, even though I'm just using the YouTube videos in there. Anyway, so what's happening is you have to therefore upwardly rotate. You have to elevate. You have to lift your shoulders because you're pushing into the ground. So the cueing, if you're going to cue the anatomy at all in this pose, would not be to pack your shoulders down and back. It would not be to draw your shoulders down and back, because that's not resisting the force here that's happening in the hands and transmitting through the arms and into the shoulders. So let's look at the opposite example. So hanging. So now let's back up. What is happening in the arm and the shoulder? Well, in this case, due to gravity, because you are holding on to this bar, gravity would have your arm basically pull all the way out of its socket. Gravity, if you did nothing and your tissues were, weak enough, or your shoulder was unstable or something, you might see that like you would dislocate the joint because the ball would just pop out of the socket. Now I'm being ridiculous. Don't get afraid of pull-ups because I just said that. But my point is that the direction of force is one that pulls the shoulder up. And therefore, what you have to do is pull the shoulder back down. Okay? So this is going to seem like it contradicts a lot of, now people are starting to understand that the shoulders down and back cue in yoga poses is usually not applicable. And so this might seem like it's contradicting that statement. So if we're supposed to upwardly rotate, if the natural scapulohumeral rhythm, meaning the way that your shoulder and your arm move together, is that when your arm moves up and forward, then your shoulder blade must also move up and forward. So then why am I telling you, if you're hanging, to pull the shoulder down and back? Because the force is trying to pull your arms up and out. And really what you have to do is resist that force to take out the slack and reset your shoulders back into their normal sort of comfortable overhead position. Okay, it's really just about stabilizing the joints. Okay, you could just relax, but and you could relax in downward facing dog, and you could relax here, but you're going to have more control over the movement if you resist the force. So we see here, if we compare these two examples, in downward facing dog and in a hanging motion, hanging from a bar, your arms are over your head in both cases. Your shoulder joint is in the same position in both movements, or both poses, if you will. And believe it or not, and it might not sound like it, and I'll explain this in a second, but your shoulder blade is also in basically the same position in both positions, okay? In both downward facing dog and hanging. So even though in downward facing dog, you push into the floor, and so you're elevating, you're trying to elevate and upwardly rotate, you're trying to squeeze your shoulder blades into your armpit. And in hanging, you're trying to pull your shoulder blades slightly down and pack the lats, if you like that cue. Even though the cueing is the opposite, even though the muscular action, the energetic, cueing is the opposite, the final result is that your shoulder is in the same actual position. So hold on to your seats and I'll explain why. So the result, let's rewind and look at the graphic from the first slide. So we have a tug of war, and if we have just one force, if we have one team that wins the tug of war, let's say there is this rope in the center of the tug of war. If gravity wins, then the tug of war, the rope, which is going to represent your shoulder joint and scapula. So we call that the shoulder girdle, basically. Okay, I've left out some parts, but basically your shoulder girdle, the knot, we're calling this the knot in this analogy, shifts towards wherever the force is directed. So if the force of gravity is trying to compress your shoulder, then it's gonna get compressed unless you resist it. If the force of gravity, or really it's the tensional force of holding onto a bar, is trying to pull your shoulder up and out, if you don't resist that force, it's gonna pull it up and out. So the knot shifts, the knot here shifts towards the force. If, however, we apply an equal and opposite force, okay, this would pertain to an isometric contraction, meaning you're not moving, but your muscles are working. So in an isometric contraction, if we apply an equal and opposite force to the force that we're encountering, the load, the gravity, or if you're lifting weights, then the weights or whatever, then the knot stays perfectly neutral. Okay, so everything sort of evens out if we resist that force. And so even in dynamic movement, in concentric and eccentric contractions, where you're slowly moving, or you're slowly moving this way or that way, it's a matter of controlling. So you're still resisting the force, but you slowly let the force win. Right? And that would be usually an eccentric contraction. Or the opposite might be true, where there's a force and you're resisting it, and you slowly win over the force. So you slowly win the tug of war game, and we might call that a concentric contraction. Okay, so it's all about how you interplay with force. So I'm going to now go back to a thing that I said, that was no matter whether you lift up the shoulder or you pull down the shoulder, your shoulder actually ends up in the same place. How could that possibly be true? Well, if we have on the left here is your normal, truly neutral position for the shoulder blade and the shoulder joint. And then on the right here, we have what happens when you reach over your head. What you see is that the shoulder blade moves out into the armpit and it moves up and forward, okay, when the arm reaches overhead. So if you are hanging from a bar, what's going to happen is that your shoulder positioning is not going to look like the picture on the right. Your shoulder is going to actually be higher, even higher than this right-handed picture. So if you take out the slack, you end up in this position. You technically still end up in an upwardly rotated position, even though in order to get there, you technically downwardly rotated. Okay? If that is confusing, go again to my website, take this shoulder impingement course, and you will understand how you'll understand a lot more about the shoulder joint mechanics. So the opposite is also true. If your arm is overhead and you start in this upwardly rotated position, let's call this overhead neutral or upwardly rotated in an ideal position, whatever that really means, then the force of gravity with your hands on the floor is trying to push your shoulder blade back and down into this first position. Well, that's not really going to happen unless you totally just give up and let gravity totally win. So what you do is you push, you resist the force, and you bring it back to this normal overhead position. So if the force is pushing your shoulder girdle down, you push it back up into this normal sort of upwardly rotated position. If the force from hanging is pulling your shoulder up, even, like really, really far up, you're just taking out the slack and bringing it back into this normal upwardly rotated position. Okay. So the simple way of thinking about all of this is that wherever the force is, it's a game of how you interact with that force and how you resist that force. Okay. So if you're in a plank, you're pushing into the ground, versus if you're hanging on to somebody and, you're pulling open a door, you need to pull the shoulder blade back. Where's the force? And you need to do the opposite. Okay. This is, again, mostly relevant to isometric contractions, but with dynamic movements, it also applies. It's just a game of who wins the tug of war and how fast, and making sure that you're in control of that process happening. Okay. And again, this is not necessarily saying that there's a single 100% perfect position for the shoulder to be overhead. It is mainly saying that in order to have stable, control over your joints in the motion, you do need to resist force. Okay. Thank you. If you have questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next episode.